So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Sridhar Solur is the Senior VP for Xfinity Home IoT and Data Services at Comcast. He leads product development for Xfinity Home Services, which includes devices and services in IoT, home automation, and home security. Prior to this, he worked at HP, where he was most recently the general manager for wearables and IoT. He led the creation and launch of the Michael Sebastian smartwatch, led the development of Engineered by HP, and he was a founding partner for HP's incubator initiative, which enables early stage companies and startups to work with HP. Before that, at HP, he was worldwide director for mobility and cloud services. He founded and directed ePrint, and he was also a managing partner for corporate ventures in the UK, chief technologist for wireless and networking practice. He earned his BSc degree in electrical engineering from National Institute of Technology in India and his MBA degree from Boston University. So you can see that he's done a lot of interesting and varied things, and he's going to draw on some of that experience to talk about the third wave, tech and trends. Sri.
Good morning. I'm really happy to be back in New England. 20 years ago, I actually moved to the United States, and my port of entry was Boston. I worked for a company that was very prominent in New England, Digital Alta Vista. How many of you remember those? Yeah. And then went on to work for, Compaq, HP, multiple countries, and I'm a product builder. I love technology, but I build products. I also look at the confluence of when technology matures, and the timing is awfully important. It's not just about technology, it's about socio-economic trends that come together to create a perfect storm, to create critical mass for those products. Today, I'm going to talk about technologies and some socio-economic trends. And let's have fun, right, as we kind of put that together. I was listening to Scott's presentation, and overwhelmed. It's amazing. He's gone to great depths. I'm going to take this up a couple of levels higher, and let's see if we can see patterns together. With that said, what I want to do is very straightforward. Scott was asking questions earlier and said, can you please raise your hands if you have echo? And I saw a few hands going up, some reluctantly. It's still early in the morning, so I'm going to ask you a question here. How many of you carry smartphones? That's good, You guys really raise your hands. So, it's difficult to ask that question the other way. How many of you carry dumb phones? Phones have become smarter. But let me take a step back here. We'll talk about the world of mobile. But before that, I want to look at the last 100 years of technology. I'm going to focus on technologies that have achieved exponential ramp up and critical mass in the United States. This is not my slide, by the way. This is Mary Meeker's slide. I'm sure all of you follow her internet trends, very data-driven, and I wait to listen to her with bated breath and a fluttering heart every year, right? And a few times. This was in 2012. It's a very insightful slide, because in the last 100 years, there have been only 4 technologies that have achieved critical mass with an exponential ramp up. In the 1920s, it was AM radio. In the 50s, it was television. In the early 2000s, it's the rise of the internet. And then 2008 and after, it's been the rise of mobile. What's really interesting is every time there has been an exponential ramp up of technology. It has happened in and around times of economic recession or depression. How many of you knew about this? I don't know about the cause and effect, but there is some relevance, there is correlation. We'll come back to this. We'll come back to this. But then, let's analyze the last 15 years of our lives. When you look at the last 15 years, it's fairly straightforward. The first two technologies that you saw in the last 100 years were one directional, right? It was just broadcast technologies. But internet and mobile are bidirectional. So let's look at the last 15 years. The era of internet, 300 million devices connected to the internet. Most of the computing or money initially happened around the edge. You had laptops, desktops, operating system vendors, chipset vendors. Think about the architectures. There was a lot of innovation that was happening there. And in the world of cloud, and internet was there long before 70s, 80s, 90s, but it just did not take off. Every time a technology takes off, there are other supporting components that add to create a perfect storm. In the era of internet, till e-commerce became really big, till content got moved to the web, internet did not really take off. So the era of internet, 300 million devices, the cloud has content and commerce, life was good. And then came the era of mobile. The era of mobile, just look at this, 3 billion devices. From 300 million to 3 billion, it's 10x. Peter Diamandis has this amazing concept of 10x thinking. His point of view is very simple. When you solve a problem, you can incrementally make a process better by 10%. But when you decide to make it 10x better, you look at the problem in a much different way. Let's turn that upside around. When you move from 300 million to 3 billion, anytime there is a 10x effect that happens, you change lives. Industries go through a massive transformation. Scott spoke about how the leasing industry, car leasing industry potentially could change. Insurance industries could change, right? And then there is always like $1 trillion impact. The power of 10x. Either the way you solve the problem or whenever the consequence of anything happening 10x. But the beauty is there was another C that was born. For mobile to become relevant, how many of you remember the days of WAP phones? WAP? You know what WAP stands for? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to remember. What does WAP stand for? It's, gosh, where are the phones? I don't know. So, no. This was a little protocol on the phones, on these old Nokia phones. It's much before Series 60 and Series 40, where you could browse the web with a phone, right? I call the era between the two eras as the hangover era, right? This is the era of hangover. In the hangover era, you know what happens? You tend to use the methodologies that are relevant in the previous era into designing the new devices. Remember the days when on the phones, when you would look at a website, it looked really wonky, The era of internet was search first. In the era of mobile, it's mobile first. But for the era of mobile to actually take off, as I said, you need to have a perfect storm of technologies coming together. You needed cloud computing to become relevant. So, and in addition to that, community took off. I should actually be saying social, but for the sake of drama, I'm trying to keep the letter C of the alphabets going. So community and cloud actually had to play a major role for mobile to take off. But let's also look at other components. You went from a development methodology of like, the world of waterfall, from the world of client server to the world of agile. Those things changed. In addition to that, business models. Companies that played a huge role in the era of internet. Think processor companies. Think companies that were charging for the operating system in the era of internet. What happened? 2010 was still the era of, 2008, 2009 was still the era of internet. 2014, the era of mobile. Do you know of any company that still charges for an operating system today? Very, very few, handful, very specialized operating systems. But 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you still paid for a desktop operating system. Do you remember that era? So companies' business models have changed. Companies that owned foundries, made their own chipsets. Look at what happened to them in the era of mobile, their market share in the era of mobile. It's companies that licensed the architecture for the chipsets that have a deeper penetration. I can go on and on. The era of internet, everything was on premise in an enterprise. Security was firewall, intrusion detection, antivirus on every device. I don't know how many of you remember this. In the early days of smartphones, I'm talking in the hangover era of smartphones, you had companies peddling antivirus for your mobile phones. Let me ask you this question. How many of you have antivirus on your mobile phones? But then, what happened? Everything shifted to the cloud. As Scott mentioned, you went from the edge, and in 4 to 5 years, you had MDM technologies, mobile device management technologies, and everything went up back to the cloud, right? Now, let's look at where we are in the new era, right? In the new era, for the sake of drama, I added another component called context, which is very relevant. That's in the cloud. But I also added something called a cluster, which is there at the edge. Just like between any two eras, let's go ahead and add the hangover era. The theme of my presentation might be all about hangovers, but won't go there. So you went from an edge to the cloud, and then you suddenly moved away from the era of glass slabs. Everything about connectivity was associated with glass slabs. Now you see everything else being connected, right? Which is, who gave the name enchanted objects? It's not me. Does anybody know? Go take a look. It's someone from MIT who called this the era of enchanted objects. IoT is a really boring name. Let's add some romance this morning. Let's call it enchanted objects. And in the era of enchanted objects, you see two things that are happening. One, technologies in the cloud and technologies in the edge. When there was a question asked to Scott earlier talking about, is it all about the edge, or where should we focus on? Again, the answer is it depends. Contextual technologies like AI and ML, we'll talk about it a little bit, and then mesh-based technologies, in layer 2 and application layer at the edge are taking off. And we'll figure out, certain mantras. In the era of internet, in the world of networking, there used to be a mantra called, switch when you can, route if you must. Similarly, the way things are going in the era of IoT or enchanted objects, it could be mesh when you can, and cloud, when you must. That could be, one of the mantras that you can work on. But then, again, taking a step back, we have looked into 3 eras, exponential technologies, each one changing lives, transforming industries, creating a $1 trillion impact. But then let's remember this. We are still in the very early stages of the era of IoT, very early stages. The rules are still being written. Mobile First by Luke Wablowski did not come out until very late, into the mobile era. So you here in the next 2 days are going to be looking at what rules are relevant. None of us here are clairvoyant, but all we know is the two technologies that can actually catapult IoT or enchanted objects to mainstream are the technologies associated with context, which is AI, ML, technologies associated with cluster, which is mesh and blockchain and so on and so forth. So I'm going to stop here and wait for this to sink in and just go very quickly into how you provide enchantment via context and cluster. Very simple. Contextual computing is your situational, attitudinal, preferential experiences. You munch that together, and since the enchanted objects, the enchantment comes from the objects in the era of IoT, there's a little bit of caution. I say this very carefully because in the era of internet, when you were putting credit cards to buy stuff on the web, you had regulatory and compliance requirements, well known, PCI, right? And to take care of your personal identity, you had PII related compliance aspects. In the era of IoT, there are 4 different kinds of data. Internet of Me data, which is PII. Internet of Us data, which is your attitudinal, behavioral attributes, which is, I think far more relevant to provide you enchantment, but in the wrong hands could be awfully more dangerous. Do you know if there is any regulatory component compliance aspects about your behavioral, attitudinal, and preferential data today? Do you know if that should reside in a centralized cloud, or should it just belong to you somewhere in the mesh with no centralized body? So Internet of Us data. And then you have the Internet of It data, which is just raw sensor data, door opening, closing, Internet of those, your environmental attributes, air quality, so on and so forth. In the next 2 days, you're going to be thinking about how to secure some of those data components. And I want to highlight that today we do have certain technologies, decentralized technologies, that can keep the data just to yourself with no centralized body, technologies like blockchain. So won't go into details, but there is one thing that I want to highlight. In 2014, in the Western economy, the average number of sensors that a person on a day-to-day basis came in contact with was like 32. 2017, it's 1,000 sensors. Before moving back to the States a few years ago, 6 years ago, I lived in London. I was told that an average individual gets photographed 300 times a day in central London. I used to smile walking in London. I wanted to look good in all those photos. All right, let's quickly have this fun exercise about, we looked at 100 years, then we looked at the last 15 years. Let's look at the next 5 years, all right? And let's see this. Number of people will live in the world of increasing population and inflation, correct? So, and the number of objects that have been connected to the internet, 5 billion, 10 billion, 30 billion, that could change, not clairvoyant. I have sources from where I've picked this up, but it's approximately in the ballpark. So, population of people connected to the internet and objects connected to the internet is this slide. I'll let you absorb this, and let's just go next. Very complex slide. Please don't read it. Don't. I want you to just follow as I draw on this slide. In the last 15 years, the movement has been associated with speeds and feeds. We are intoxicated by speeds and feeds. It was the gigahertz of the processor. It was about megapixel associated with cameras. How many of you remember, when our phones came with 1 megapixel camera? Oh, I had tears of joy rolling down my cheeks. And then it was 13 megapixel, and then there was a path, there was 4 and then 13. And then Nokia came up with a 41 megapixel camera. I'm like, what do you do with that, right? So the era till 2015 was speeds, feeds, flat computing, race, and suddenly I think Moore's law kind of gave up with packing, the number of transistors within a small area. And then we started looking at depth. We said, from a camera, let's look into depth cameras. From microphones, we went to far field microphones. From normal computing to neuromorphic computing. Suddenly, computers and the associated peripheral functions are looking more and more like humans. Do you agree? So you went from, CPU, GPU, you're moving towards NPU. You're going from like GPUs to vision and voice coprocessors. Somewhere in there you lace that with AI. Computing is now far more human-like, trying to understand patterns. We are in that era. I'm not even going to go into what's going to happen 2020 plus into quantum computing, not there yet. But look at what happened to the immersive experiences. We went from better cameras to like depth cameras, directional audio. We went from sentiment analysis to feeling. And we went from the era in the 2010 to 2015, this whole thing, I lived in Portland, Oregon. So this whole thing about being vegan, being organic, right? How many of you are into vegan, organic? Just raise your hands, it's okay, it's just an exercise, there's nothing wrong, all right? And 2, feeling things, brain-machine interface, nanobots for cancer. And if you actually look at all the trends, I'm going to summarize the trends as we go into the world of enchanted objects and IoT. Computing is moving from centralized to decentralized with a touch of human aspects. Experiences, this was all about sentiment analysis. How many of you did that Facebook experiment on age? No? Gosh, I have a lot of time on my hands, I guess. My apologies. So we went from the era of centralized to decentralized, sentiments to sentience, like feeling. We went from robotics to components being integrated into our body, from the era of vegan and organic to bionic. And that's the direction that we are moving into. I highlight this because I spoke to you about the confluence for any technology to achieve critical mass and exponential ramp up. You need other components coming together to create this perfect storm. But what I have not spoken to you about are the socio-economic trends, and we'll talk about that now. And we will bring this all together on how this is a third wave of connectivity, right? So that's the direction that I'm taking. With that said, let's look at trends. Nothing about technology, we're talking about socioeconomic trends. The data for this came in from one of my good friends. His name is Andrew Baldwell. We worked together back at HP, and here it is. The world is moving into cities. Today, we are talking about 30% of the US population living in cities, it's going to turn out to be close to 75% of the US population is going to be living in cities by 2030. That is a staggering statistic. So there's a migration that's happening into cities. So when people move into clusters, you're moving from the era of an agrarian economy to an industrialized economy to a services economy to a shared economy. You're not going to be focused on assets, you're going to be focused on access. So the new era is going to be the era of access in a sharing economy. So you're going to be sharing physical objects. The next 2 days, you got to be thinking what happens to your digital aspects of you in the era of sharing economy, because this is the era of IoT. All this is going to come together, right? And most of the big cities are going to be outside the United States. We're not going to go talk about this today, but this is one trend that you need to remember. So all the security solutions that you're going to focus on and build and think about is going to be about, what's going to happen when people live in densely populated clusters. What's going to happen to security? Right? We're moving from, I said, agrarian, industrialized, services, sharing, experience economy. And when you talk about experience economy, you're talking about these amazing objects connected to the internet to deliver enchantment into your lives, right? And create new experiences. You need to figure out how you can imbue security into these new experiences. Another trend is people are living longer. For the first time in the history of mankind, a couple of months ago, the population of individuals over the age of 55 was greater than children under the age of 10. If you were born in the 1820s, the average lifespan of an individual, any guesses? I'm the only one talking, come on. Yeah, somewhere around 30-ish. 30-ish, it was then in the 1820s. The percentage population of people living below the poverty line in early 1800s, 80+%. Today, average lifespan of an individual is between 79 to 83, depending on where you live. That's huge. The number of people below the poverty line is below 7%. So, there is collective progress that the mankind is making, which is brilliant. But let's go back to the demographics. There is going to be an aging demographics in the era of IoT. What this means is people, 65 and older, many of them who are working, it's close to around 800 million people, because you just can't retire at 65, because you're going to live longer. That means you need to save. Look at, what's going to happen to the pension funds, the pressure on the pension funds. And these technologies associated with IoT are going to keep you, alive longer. You're going to live healthier. You're going to potentially live with chronic diseases, but much longer. It's a rising tide. It's going to lift all boats. So you play in the era of healthcare and IoT, it's a very good place to play. You look at a lot of industries playing in that space. But then now, you're not just talking about wearables. For the first time in the history of language, when someone says, I have a chip on my shoulder, it might be a really good thing, So I want you guys to know. So in addition to all of that, we're going to live in a very agile world. Just look at industries. In the mid-80s, the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500 was 35 years. It's come down to 18. It's projected to be 4 years. It's going to be awfully slippery on top. So you want to make sure the way you work the APIs that you build allow for a lot of flexibility. But then, we all know this, the more connected you are, the more flexible you are, the less secure you are. It's not my problem, it's your problem, okay? So you guys need to find solutions. But I just want to quickly summarize here. What I want to say is, what we have done so far is we have looked at 100 years, and then we looked at the 3 eras, spent a lot of time between the 3 connected eras since 2000, the internet, mobile, and the era of IoT. I munged in some of the technology components, brought some socioeconomic trends, so that the next 2 days when you spend your time here, you actually look at all those things coming together as you build security solutions. But then, I wanted to take a shot at what 2030 looks like. Again, this is a work done by my friend that I'm presenting, and here it is. In 2030, this is what life potentially could be all about. And I want you to go about looking at centralized to decentralized. It's not just happening with computing. It's happening with water harvesting. It's happening with energy harvesting. This is a trend that goes beyond computing. And personalized medicine, that's happening. How many of you here take vitamin, minerals, and supplements? It's a good thing, but you also know that 90+% of that is not absorbed by your body. There are companies looking into taking the data associated with you, your genes, and customizing VMS, vitamin, minerals, and supplements just for you. Medicine is going to be personalized. So, with that said, I just want to conclude. In the last 15 years, there have been 2 technologies that have achieved exponential ramp up. It has changed lives, transformed industries, and brought in a $1 trillion impact. The third 10x innovation is on the rise. But remember, we are still in the hangover era. If someone claims they know the rules of IoT, it's still being formed. Context and cluster are the 2 patterns that we are seeing. It's no longer about the cloud alone. You're talking about context and cluster, which is basically AI, ML on one side, and mesh, blockchain, and technologies like the other. That's going to contribute to make this, drive this to critical mass. Some of the mantras, you had search first, mobile first, AI first. That's not what, and I'm just repeating what Sundar Pichai said. And there are rules that are being written right now. Similarly, for Internet of Us data, you may want to think about mesh when you can, cloud if you must. And then you want to intersect with what else is going on around in this world associated with urbanization, aging demographic, and this trend where we are going to be a part of the thing in the Internet of Things. You want to call it Internet of Humans, go ahead. We are moving from the era of organic to bionic. We will see unprecedented change. And for organizations to live and thrive, they have to be agile. Now, for the fun question. Remember, I started this slide with Mary Meeker's slide. And in Mary Meeker's slide, every time there has been an exponential ramp up of technologies, what has happened? There has been an era of recession or depression. I'm not an economist, but the biggest question is, what will happen to the economy in the next couple of years or so? I don't know, but I just thought I'll throw it out there. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions?
So we have a few minutes for questions. Any questions from the audience?
Let me wait. There we go. So some architectures are inherently more or less securable. If IoT proves to just be harder to secure than things that we've seen, do we have any evidence, positive or negative, that's going to affect adoption rate at all?
It's a loaded question, but so let me put it this way. A year or two from now, you would have a different question to a speaker here. I say this because we are still in the hangover era where we have gimmicky objects solving first world problems and not tier 1 problems. There has been democratization of hardware with programs like Kickstarter, where the enchantment has been given prominence over securing, the privacy, and even protocols that have been brought by standards bodies. If you look at the basics of security, the 4 things that we were taught in the era of internet was the best way to remember security is the word PAIN. I'm sure most of you know this: privacy, authentication, integrity, and non-repudiation. If you just take the basics of privacy, the gold standard in protocol, and look at some of the technologies associated in the era of IoT and say, are we up to the gold standard of security? We're not there. We are focused so much on the enchantment of the object, and this is time. Communities like yours have to step up, and I am positive that the direction that we are moving in with some of the robust technologies that are around here, that we will be able to secure the new world order. So nothing specific, but remember, we are in the hangover era. Nobody is clairvoyant, and we are getting there. And as Scott highlighted, we have to work with universities, standards bodies, and go ahead and secure both the cluster and the cloud.
Yeah.
It appears that right now the climate is in the country, and actually through the Western world, is we have 2 movements pulling in the opposite direction. We have globalist and we have nationalistic populist. In your opinion, will technology affect the outcome, or will the societal pull influence the technology?
Wow, I'm a technologist at heart, and an optimist. And if I had not focused on this career, I would have been my love history historian. I would say, if you look at the progress made by mankind in all the years that we have lived, I think the collective good and progress associated with technology that I highlighted, human life, poverty, you look at all those components, it is above and beyond any other factors that are happening underneath. And you can go back to the 14th century, 15th century, look at the dynamics, look at the improvements, and you will see that progress is going to triumph everything. So it's less about individual movements. I'm very, very confident that you will see progress in terms of bettering people's lives, living longer, and making this a better place. So philosophical, but I don't have any other answer that's specific.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question. Okay, thanks, speaker.
Thank you.